60, The Answer.
66 at O'Hare. Next news 8:30. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Build business with Chamber 630, one of the largest business organizations in DuPage County. Marketing your business and connecting clients is their priority. Visit chamber630.com or call 630-968-4050 to join today.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, updating one of our top stories. This is the abortionist recently deceased Klopfer in Will County. The more than 2,200 fetal remains that were found in his home. And Amy, you talked to his widow's attorney and have some new information for us.
Yeah, I just got off the phone with attorney Kevin Bolger, who describes a pretty horrifying sight. He said that the two daughters were cleaning out the house. They said that their late father was a hoarder, and they opened up a cardboard box, and in it was a hermetically sealed bag, and inside the bag were fetuses. And these cardboard boxes were all over the house. Most of them were in the garage, but some then he had another garage that he used to store these fetuses. But this is very important. On most bags, the name of the mother was on the bag and the date that the abortion was performed. Some dating back as far as 20 years. And I asked, why did he do it? Was it a cost-saving measure? And he said, we have no idea. But he was a hoarder, and so was Gosnell. He was a hoarder as well, and it would have piles of debris and garbage stacked up to the ceiling. But a lot of them were these cardboard boxes, again with hermetically sealed fetuses inside, to the tune of 2,246. And he got word this morning that the Indiana coroner wants some of these bodies or fetuses returned to Indiana. And the crime scene has been fully processed.
Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb and members of the Republican delegation, congressional delegation from Indiana, have called for a federal investigation into this gruesome discovery. In addition, you've had the Bishop of the Joliet Diocese, one of the bishops, Bishop Conlon from the Joliet Diocese, offer to work with government as well as other compassionate social service agencies to provide a proper burial for all of these dead children.
And one, Serena Dykson, she's a former patient, had a late-term abortion with the doctor. She wants her baby back, and she's now a pro-lifer.
That shock turned into lying in bed sobbing at the thought of my baby being on his property. If he could have the babies all these years later, I have a right to know if she was one of them.
We'll begin there with Michelle Malkin, senior editor at Conservative Review, host of Michelle Malkin Investigates. Of course, she's going to be at our Freedom Jamboree coming up in a few weeks. Freedom Fest, sure. She's got a new book, Open Borders, Inc., Who's Funding America's Destruction, that released last week. Michelle, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So who's funding America's destruction? I know this is not all-encompassing, but it seems like we are, in part, when it comes to the forced funding of Planned Parenthood in the wake of what we may have here with a Midwestern version of Gosnell.
Yeah, no question about it. Taxpayers have been forced to fund the most fundamental destruction, the destruction of human life for years and years and years. We have President Trump, who has taken steps now that have induced Planned Parenthood to refuse at least some of those federal funds. But the fact is that you have state health agencies and state regulators across the country, whether it's Chicago or in Philadelphia, where I am right now, and covered the Gosnell horror for years and years before it broke out into the national news, who were silent co-conspirators. And that's the problem here, is that when you've got the death lobby and the death industry subsidized by taxpayers working with regulators who looked the other way for decades, this is the logical outcome of that. And if people are deluded into thinking that this is the exception rather than the rule, one of the things that should have been learned after Gosnell is that there were many so-called doctors like this, Dr. Deaths, who've been operating undercover, and I fear for what we may discover on down the line like this.
Well, when you hear about this story outside of Chicago and Crete, Illinois, I mean, it sounds exactly like what Dr. Gosnell did, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, and why should we be shocked that doctors who are supposed to abide by the Hippocratic oath of doing no harm and then turn around murder innocent unborn lives end up being ghouls like this who, in the case of Gosnell, had trophy cases of unborn babies' feet. Again, I mean, I think the question is how many other Dr. Gosnells and ones like this. I covered Andrew Rutland in Southern California and another Dr. Stephen Bingham in Maryland who were immediately investigated after the Gosnell case broke out into the public, and then it just sort of seems to disappear.
In part, we're funding America's destruction, too, by the companies we patronize, aren't we? I'm referencing your book, Open Borders, Inc., who's funding America's destruction. The corporate America.
Yes. If we're going to segue to immigration and open borders, I think it is an eye-opener in the book that many of these corporations, which ironically enough are being picketed by the social justice warrior groups funded by George Soros, are themselves filled with open borders ideologues. And you have Microsoft, which was picketed by some of these groups in Manhattan, which internally has thousands of employees demanding that their supervisors cut off any kind of IT contracts working with the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So the demonization of ICE, the Abolish ICE movement, is coming from within corporate America and outside it with these agitators who are now inciting violence across the country against ICE.
It was a remarkable statement that Ilhan Omar made over the video that surfaced that she had made a little more than a month ago, but she was asked about it on Face the Nation this weekend. It was after her visit to Ghana, along with Nancy Pelosi, where they visited apparently dungeons where the slave trade took place 400 years ago, and she compared the dungeons in Ghana used in the slave trade 400 years ago to the situation at the border with our family separation policy. Of course, she meant no offense to Customs and Border Patrol agents. She was just making a comparison that they're doing the same things that slave traders did 400 years ago in Africa.
Yeah, no offense intended, I'm sure.
Right.
There are several chapters in the book that deal with the true causes of these illegal alien caravans that are laying siege to our southern border, and who's truly responsible for inducing these illegal alien parents to pay coyotes to bring children and drag them across the desert with complete strangers, many of whom are abusing these children along the way, or dragooning young girls and teenagers into human trafficking rings. It is the pull factors, the magnets that are supported by the people who pose as the most compassionate people on the planet, when they're the ones that are imposing such misery, not only on the people who are participating in these global smuggling rings, but also all of the rest of us who have to bear the consequences of uncontrolled immigration anarchy. And unfortunately, that includes many religious nonprofits that enjoy a great reputation as the world's saviors of the poor and oppressed. And particularly in the Chicago area, I know you have many informed listeners who are quite aware of the radicalization of the Catholic Church by Saul Alinsky, the Industrial Areas Foundation. I connect all the dots. With money there, basically the social justice organizing arm of the Catholic Church, which has helped stand up an entire illegal alien shelter network, which again incentivizes people to do incredibly dangerous things when they could be staying in their home countries and holding their own governments accountable, I don't know, for spending and wasting away all of the billions of dollars of foreign aid that we pour into them.
And it's not just Central Americans. I mean, there's a large contingency of Haitians who even got into a physical altercation with Mexican military on their southern border, and people from Africa and India too.
Well, I've been reporting on that exact phenomenon since the September 11th terror attacks because the entire world knows that if you can manufacture a fake story of asylum or manufacture a fake family, that once you touch foot on American soil, immediately surrender at a border patrol sector and you will be caught and released. And fortunately, we have the Trump administration, better late than never, finally addressing that revolving door and trying to shut off those magnets. But the other problem, too, is that it's not just the southern border. I've been covering problems on the northern border since 2002. And the book talks about the refugee resettlement racket, where people are waltzing in through the front door. And many of these religious organizations that have lucrative government contracts to the tune of billions of dollars over the last 25 years are cooperating with the United Nations, many transnational organizations that explicitly are trying to undermine American sovereignty.
Part of the other infrastructure with respect to funding the left, and I use that as a proxy for funding America's destruction, is nonprofits. There was a piece, I think it was in the Journal, I'm going by memory though, recently, looking at, I think it was just a couple of years ago, maybe calendar year 2017, and the distribution of funds from foundations to policy advocacy groups. It was something like $7 billion to left policy groups, C4s, some C3s, as compared to something like $2 billion to center-right conservative, center-right policy advocacy groups, and that disparity in funding that's substantial in terms of what floods the media airwaves from organizations that are set up to do just that.
Yes, there are very important chapters in the book, and I identify within 500 pages more than 400 plus individual organizations, tax-exempt nonprofits that spread the money. I mean, it's both private philanthropy and government funding. Open Society Foundations obviously is a big kahuna run by George Soros. He's earmarking $18 billion out of his $25.2 billion net worth to help these groups proliferate. And they're in every backyard in America. If you wonder why it is that the rent-a-mob is able to organize on a dime, it's because of that money, which is leveraged. Because, as I say, hundreds of those organizations are tax-exempt, nonprofit. Then they spread the grants that they get from George Soros to, it's like, you remember that Fabergé shampoo commercial? I'll tell two friends, you tell two friends.
And so on and so on and so on.
It's like that, and so on and so on and so on. I think, for individual Americans who feel like this is a completely insurmountable problem, I do recommend that people start small in their own ability to defund Open Borders, Inc. If you realize, for example, that the George Clooney and the Clooney Foundation are working with the Tides Foundation and the Young Center there at the University of Chicago Law School to provide free pro bono legal representation to illegal aliens to bring their cases up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Stop giving them money. Stop supporting Hollywood. Stop supporting the Open Borders media propagandists. And then hold your own elected officials accountable for not realizing that we should every day be questioning what these organizations are doing. Why don't we have IRS investigations of this? Why did we stop at Acorn?
And what about big tech? And especially the concerning testimony from several weeks back when Dennis Prager was before a Senate subcommittee, and psychiatrist Dr. Bob Epstein talked about, per his research in Google over the last 6 years, what he estimates the number of votes they moved in 2016 and the number of votes they could move in 2020.
Yeah, and so again, I think that people should start small and start weaning themselves off of Google. Don't use a Chrome browser. Use DuckDuckGo as your search engine, and look for alternatives like Proton Mail, and really educate yourself about how deeply embedded big tech is with the speech police created by George Soros. There's an entire chapter on the history of the Southern Poverty Law Center, all the way up to its current role that it enjoys inside the corporate offices of Google and Facebook to help them identify enemies and have Silicon Valley cook up algorithms and artificial intelligence that is helping to deplatform some of the most effective voices in alternative media. I mean, I've been very blessed over the last 20 years to be able to spread my message on social media and plant my flag in that space and create two successful social media businesses. No longer. I've seen my friends be kicked off, not left and right, but right and alt-right, I suppose. I don't know what you call it. People who support the sovereignty of this country deemed enemies that have to be wiped off the entire face of the internet. That's alarming, and that's what fueled me to get this book out there and talk about it like I am with you all.
She is Michelle Malkin. She's a senior editor of Conservative Review, host of Michelle Malkin Investigates. The book we've been discussing, you get the top lines, and I'll get the book so you get the details. Open Borders, Inc., Who's Funding America's Destruction? And Michelle is going to be with us on November 2nd at our Freedom Fest,
Summit.
Jamboree,
Don't
Fair, Consent Carnival, whatever we're calling it.
It's Freedom Summit, and if you want tickets, go to 560theanswer.com and click on the Freedom Summit banner.
Michelle Malkin, thanks so much for joining us. Look forward to seeing you in November.
Thank you. See you soon.
Take care.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro